Due to a certain incident during her childhood, 17-year-old Ipsay has spent many bedridden years. While she isn't physically handicapped in any sense, such is the psychological impact of her traumatic experience that she is virtually chained to her bed. Her life is precisely as monotonous and sad as can be expected in such a situation. Ipsay's existence is so vulnerable that a bunch of boys break into her room almost every night and use her house for band practice. One such day, their leader, Sandman, tells her that he sincerely considers her to be precious. Upon the arrival of Ipsay's caregiver, when his band hurriedly leaves through the window, Sandman quickly follows them out. The caregiver, Ja Young, is a seemingly good young lady, but it is soon revealed that she abuses Ipsay verbally and, at times, physically as well. Additionally, the social worker assigned to Ipsay's case, Mr. Kim, also has not so noble intentions of his own towards her. His thoughts are interrupted by the arrival of the town priest and Ipsay's doctor that morning. The doctor informs the priest that Ipsay seems to have grown weaker than ever. He says that she could have lost the will to get better and to live her life. Since it has already been quite a long time that she has been like this, he says that the only option left is to pray for her. The priest then prays over Ipsay and takes his leave. He informs Ja Young and Mr. Kim that he is going to be away for a few days and requests them to continue taking good care of Ipsay. Over a meal later, Jae Young asks Mr. Kim when she would be awarded a permanent position, since it had already been a year since she had taken up the role of Ipsay's primary caregiver. Mr. Kim replied that she needed to be patient and that she would get one if there happened to be any vacancies. That night, a bunch of guys from the neighborhood shine lasers into Ipsay's room and mock her for being nothing more than a vegetable. When she finally manages to fall asleep, she disturbingly dreams of when she was told to not make a sound and instead sleep as if she didn't exist. She wakes up the next morning to find a strange man sleeping in her bed with her. When she pushes him off the bed, the man does the same to her. Soon realizing that Ipsay wouldn't manage to get up on her own, the man then picks her up and drops her on the bed. Imprisoned earlier for reports of physical abuse and murder, this man supposedly was Ipsay's uncle, who was now out of prison. For a reason yet unknown, he has lost his power of speech and hence resorts to unconventional methods to care for Ipsay. When he notices that she has flung the food he left for her, he forcefully picks her up. She then attacks him with a fork that makes him drop her. When she painfully drags herself back towards her bed, he realizes that she can move if she is motivated enough to do so. Ensuring that Ja Young finds the front door locked and is unable to get in, the uncle then gets to work putting his plans for Ipsay into action. He first shifts a table into her room and forces her into a chair. Even as she protests, he ties her up with his belt to keep her upright, exactly as he had expected. She doesn't eat at first, but when he proceeds to eat from her plate, she grabs it back and begins eating. Ja Young comes back to the house and brings Mr. Kim with her later that day. After introducing themselves to the uncle, Mr. Kim then attempts to have a conversation with him, only to realize that he couldn't talk at all. Despite knowing the crimes he had been sentenced for, Mr. Kim has no other option but to leave Ja Young there on her own for Ipsay. He tells her to inform the elderly lady who came over at night to keep Ipsay company to look for another place to live now, since Ipsay's uncle would be staying there. Just because of his presence in the house, Ipsay's uncle is able to save her from her predators. He intrudes at just the right time when Ja Young would have begun mocking Ipsay, thereby avoiding yet another episode of torture. Later that night, while Ja Young tells the uncle about Ipsay's inability to leave her room or even her bed, Ipsay is seen dragging herself across the floor in an attempt to get downstairs. Just then, Sandman gets in through her window and picks her up to get her back to her bed. Yet again, the uncle gets to Ipsay's room just in time and then proceeds to attack Sandman. After Ja Young leaves in a hurry, the uncle boards up Ipsay's window and locks the front door as well. Irritated by the loud volume of the television that uncle was watching later that night, Ipsay manages to drag herself not just out of her bed, but even out of her room. She falls down the stairs but finally gets to the remote. When the uncle promptly throws the remote far away, she successfully pulls off the plug instead. The next morning, the bunch of people responsible for Ipsay's care gather at home with the uncle and discuss that Ipsay cannot be allowed to live with just him. Mr. Mr. Kim's main reason for such an opinion is that if even Ja Young is scared to be around the uncle, then he is definitely not safe to have around Ipsay. The priest placates Mr. Kim by reminding him that Ipsay is a grown woman, and hence they should simply leave the decision to her. When Mr. Kim insists that the uncle should find another place to live, Ipsay makes it clear that she would like him to stay. The priest speaks to the uncle in private later and assures him that he will let everyone in the neighborhood know that he is back, and also asks them not to bother him while he stays for Ipsay. Before leaving, he tells him that since it has been a long time already, he doesn't blame the uncle for whatever happened in the past. He says that as being in love was not a sin, there was no reason to punish the uncle more than he had already endured. With Ipsay left alone with her uncle, she finally begins to bloom into a better version of herself, where everyone possibly expected the uncle to be an abusive person who would do nothing to help her. The exact opposite happens in reality. Life gets happier for her as she is seen out of her room and enjoying her time with her uncle until one day when the police get home. Having supposedly received a rather disturbing report about the uncle's relationship with Ipsay, Officer Cha arrives for an investigation and brings to light yet another tidbit of the uncle's past. As it turns out, Ipsay's mother had been the victim of the crimes that the uncle was punished for, implying that he was responsible for having ended her life. Officer Cha warns the uncle that it would be extremely easy to put the blame back on him if he were to do anything wrong to Ipsay. Over breakfast the next morning, Ipsay notices her uncle's packed bag. In sign language, he confesses his crimes to her, which causes her to scream in anger and pain. After he leaves, Ipsay slips back into her old life of always being in bed. The priest comes to see her one day and tells her of how her uncle had left home soon after she was born and had come back again after she lost her father when she was just 5 years old. He had been a great help to her mother, but most of the town had eventually begun to doubt their relationship. The priest comments on how similar Ipsay now looks to her mother and confesses that he tried to save her from the strange people around her because of how much he loved her. Considering that Ipsay was on her own now, the priest thought that this was his chance to take advantage of her without anyone knowing about it or attempting to stop him. Yet again, Ipsay is saved by the uncle's fortunately timely arrival. During the fight that ensues, Ipsay hears the priest mock her uncle by saying that the illness he has is anyway going to take his life soon. Eventually, the uncle brutally beats him up enough to end his life. A while later, he stops Ipsay from suffocating herself with a wire. Having heard that he would be taken away from her life, the uncle realizes that Ipsay possibly preferred to end her life to stop yet another disappointment. But he still screams at her in an attempt to put across his thoughts and beliefs. The next morning, Ipsay decides to dye her hair a bright red for a new look. Backed by her uncle and her newfound confidence, Ipsay captures Ja Young when she comes over. The elaborately planned game of revenge begins here when the priest's father, the chief police, comes over looking for him. Since he was the one who had covered up the previous wrongdoings in the house, the uncle packs him up and transfers him to the basement. The next target is Mr. Kim. When he walks into Ipsay's bedroom and sees her covered with just flowers, he is unable to control himself but is stopped in his tracks when he sees the uncle has been hiding there. By threatening Ja Young, Ipsay and her uncle successfully get her to end Mr. Kim's life in return for all of his previous incorrect advances towards Ipsay. A similar end meets the band when they break into the house. Ipsay shines a laser on each of them in turn, and the uncle punishes them all for all their misconducts. Officer Cha is the final target as he had also taken undue advantage of Ipsay in the past. He shoots at the uncle, but the uncle also manages to get in a couple of shots, instantly ending Officer Cha's life. It is then finally revealed that a few men in the town had forced the uncle to abuse Ipsay's mother, so the blame would be on him. It was indeed he who had advised the 5-year-old Ipsay to hide and not make a sound, so she wouldn't be found. He had then ended the life of Ipsay's mother to save her from any more embarrassment and had suffered a cut across his throat that caused him to lose his voice. This was the incident Ipsay had witnessed that had a deep impact on her and completely changed her life. In the last few moments of his life, Ipsay's uncle somehow manages to urge her to get up. Finally thinking of herself as worthy enough to be a predator, Ipsay drags herself towards the front door of the house. Her opening the door and stepping out symbolizes the beginning of her new life, the kind of life she herself craved and the life that her uncle wished she lived.